This right here is an insect, or, according to the United Nations, this might actually be your future dinner. That's because, right now, globally, meat agriculture is being vilified for causing too much climate change, for using up too much land, for using up too much water, and so on and so forth. And as a part of the green agenda to fix all these meat-related problems, well, policies are being implemented across the entirety of the world, which are effectively handcuffing farmers and sometimes even completely crippling the farmers' operations. However, you might be wondering, if all of these meat and dairy and cattle farmers are put out of business in order to save the planet, what exactly are people going to eat? Where are people going to get their source of protein from? Well, fear not. That is exactly where insect farming comes in. For the past 10 or so years now, international organizations like the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the European Union, and so on and so forth have been working relentlessly to push forward and to normalize the edible insect industry, which might help to explain why, seemingly all of a sudden, we're seeing all sorts of celebrities endorsing insect food. We're seeing media outlets across the world normalizing edible bugs, and we're even starting to see children have insects be introduced into their school lunch programs. However, in order to explain how we got to this point, let's start at the very beginning. 10 years ago, all the way back in the year 2013, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, they released this report right here titled Edible Insects, Prospects for Food and Feed Security. Now, this report of theirs, it outlined how there are going to be too many people on this planet in the near future and that the current model of meat production will not be adequate to feed them all. Here's specifically how the report began. Quote, "It is widely accepted that by 2050, the world will host 9 billion people. To accommodate this number, current food production will need to almost double. Land is scarce, and expanding the area devoted to farming is rarely a viable or sustainable option. Oceans are overfished, and climate change and related water shortages could have profound implications for food production. To meet the food and nutrition challenges of today, there are nearly 1 billion chronically hungry people worldwide, and tomorrow, what we eat and how we produce it needs to be reevaluated. Inefficiencies need to be rectified, and food waste reduced. We need to find new ways of growing food." And of course, given the fact that this report is titled Edible Insects, you kind of see where they're going with this. Quote, "Edible insects have always been a part of human diets. But in some societies, there is a degree of distaste for their consumption. Insects offer a significant opportunity to merge traditional knowledge and modern science in both developed and developing countries." Now, this UN report, again, published 10 full years ago, well, it's now considered, in retrospect, one of the foundational documents in this effort to bring insect eating into mainstream Western culture. And just as a fun fact, in this UN report, there are some possible solutions to getting over people's resistance in the West to eating bugs. Here's what they wrote on this front, again, 10 full years ago. Quote, "Among the strategies to be considered for developing effective communication strategies for governments, international agencies, the private sector, and NGOs are tailoring messages for different audiences, identifying incentives for using insects as food, using success stories and best practices/experiences to promote the consumption of insects, involving local media to raise awareness, creating a communication toolkit on the importance of and opportunities for insects as food and feed, and seeking endorsements from celebrities to improve the credibility of the sector." It's kind of amazing to read this in retrospect, knowing how 10 years from when this was written, well, we have media outlets and celebrities across the whole world indeed pushing for the eating of insects. It's always fascinating to see how many of these grassroots campaigns that we see on television and on social media can be traced back to some sort of a centralized plan at the international level. Regardless, this report, it mentioned the growing human population as the main reason that people should switch over to insects as their protein source. And they cited a projection which showed that by the year 2050, there will be approximately 9 billion people on the planet, which for your reference is still currently approximately the UN projection. However, the devil here, you can say, is in the details, because when you dig into the UN's own data, it suggests that North America, as well as Europe's populations, are already near the peak of their growth expectations, meaning that this growth is not going to be because of North America and Europe, but instead, the bulk of this global human population growth is actually going to be taking place predominantly in Africa and Asia. In fact, by the year 2100, the UN expects that Africa and Asia will be home to 8 out of every 10 people on the globe. And yet, even though Africa and Asia happen to already be the two places that have a long history of eating insects, well, the UN thinks that it's the responsibility of the West, meaning North America, Europe, and Australia, to sacrifice our food culture for the good of humanity. And so already, just in the premise of their argument, you begin to start seeing cracks. And these cracks only get wider as you dig in further. For instance, to normalize the idea of eating bugs, the UN goes on, within their report, to estimate that insect eating forms part of the traditional diets of at least 2 billion people around the world. Okay, so that's a lot of people. 2 billion is no small number. However, what they fail to mention as a part of that estimate is that eating insects in a vast swath of these countries is done out of either sheer necessity and or some type of a cultural or religious reason. And in fact, aside from some expensive Asian insect delicacies, when you see villages in Africa capturing tens of thousands of mosquitoes and then cooking them up into a mosquito hamburger patty, well, they aren't necessarily doing that because they want to. It's not really just because this is their traditional cuisine. Many people across the world, especially the developing world, resort to eating insects when there are either significant food security problems in their country and or there's a lack of a stable source of animal-based protein. You very likely would not be making a mosquito patty if you had regular access to beef. Furthermore, while there are examples of societies which incorporate insects into their diet, like we just saw in Africa, there does not appear to be one single population of people anywhere on the planet whose primary source of protein is derived from insects. It doesn't appear that that's a thing. And then furthermore, there doesn't appear to be any scientific evidence which exists, as of yet, showing that a long-term diet consisting predominantly of insect-based protein is healthy for a human being. However, that has not stopped the proponents of this green agenda from continuing to push for the mass adoption of edible bugs. And normally, within their talking points, the UN and the World Economic Forum, they cite 3 specific reasons for why edible bugs are the future. The reasons are as follows. Firstly, insects produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions compared to farm animals. Secondly, insects require less feed in order to produce protein that's suitable for humans. And thirdly, insects take up less physical space. But the story gets a lot deeper, which we'll get into right after I introduce today's sponsor. That's right, the sponsor of today's episode is an absolutely awesome small elderberry farm over in beautiful Wisconsin. Now listen, as great as all these mRNA vaccines are, and I know we're all clamoring to get ever more of them into our food, well, the truth is that elderberries are some of the most potent natural sources of antioxidants, especially quercetin, which is a naturally potent antioxidant that helps to free the body of these floating free radicals and keep us happy and healthy. Elderberries are, by the way, also a great source of vitamin C as well. Now listen, I'm of course not a doctor, but I will say that drinking these elderberry extracts makes me feel good. They come straight from the beautiful ground in Wisconsin, go into these little packets, and then into my mouth. And we actually asked the owner of that farm what makes his elderberry extract different from others, and here's what he told us, quote, "I infuse elderberry flowers into the fruit extract. We're the only ones that do this in the ultimate packet, which increases the quercetin levels. Flowers blend well with the fruit because they have the same molecular composition. And quercetin has been shown to remove toxins from the body. Our elderberries are locally grown and tundra tough." And so these small elderberry packets are awesome. They're healthy and they're budget friendly. They're essentially made for people who don't need a full 8-ounce bottle of the stuff. They come in these perfectly sized small packets, so you can either take it on the go or give it to your kids as they rush off to school. And that way you can make sure that they get their daily dose of antioxidants. And best of all, right now they're offering viewers of Facts Matter a cool 20% off. Just use American20 as the promo code, American with an N, 20. And so again, it's a great product, small, beautiful farm over in Wisconsin, and it's owned by patriotic Americans who not only care about the country, but also about the truth, which is why they sponsor a program like ours. So check it out, Wisconsin Elderberry. The link will be down in the description box below. Use promo code American20 to save 20% off. And now let's head on back to the studio. However, just like with the growing population argument and the bugs are traditional food in Africa and Asia argument, the devil here is in the details as well. And so let's go through these 3 points together, starting with the argument that insects produce lower greenhouse gas emissions when you compare them to different farm animals. To start with, according to the EPA, the agriculture sector in America accounts for about 11% of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are put out by the US every single year. Of that 11%, roughly a quarter comes from the methane that's produced by livestock, especially ruminants like cows during the digestive process. And so what this means is that according to the official EPA estimate, around 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions coming from the US every single year comes from cows and other farm animals. And it's exactly this 4% that the UN would like to see reduced in order to save the planet. The only problem here, though, is that according to the studies that have been published, and I should mention there are not many that have been published, but there are some, and when they compared the farming of insects versus the farming of livestock, Well, the results were rather surprising. For instance, this study right here, which came out of the Netherlands, was comparing how some of the more popular insects stacked up against cows and pigs in terms of the CO2 that was emitted per kilogram of protein. And as you can see from the results on this graph, every species of insects they looked at produced at least 50% less emissions when you compare them to cows. This result was then heavily publicized by the environmentalists, for whom cows are typically the primary targets. However, notice something. In that same study, pig farming was found to produce lower levels of CO2 than about half of the insects that they looked at. But interestingly, you almost never hear about that part of the study. The focus in public debate is almost always on cattle, with all the other livestock just getting sort of lumped in there, regardless of their true environmental impact. And furthermore, what was conveniently left out of that particular study altogether was the comparison between insect farming and chicken farming, which, when you look at it, actually produces very similar levels of emissions. And fortunately for us, there are other studies which did look at this comparison, like this one here published in 2015, which compared how efficiently crickets could convert various types of feeds into protein when you compare them to chickens. And these researchers found that crickets who were fed a grain-based diet, similar to broiler chickens, showed little improvement in protein conversion efficiency. Here's specifically part of what the conclusion of the study wrote, quote, "When fed grain-based diets at a scale of economic relevance, populations of crickets in this study showed little improvement in protein conversion efficiency compared to broiler chickens fed similar diets," meaning that these crickets converted food into protein at a comparable rate as chickens. Furthermore, there was another study, this one here, which found similar results when comparing mealworms to chickens as well. Basically, according to these studies, it appears that chickens and these various insects take in the same amount of food to produce the same amount of protein for humans. And by the way, just as an aside, one of the reasons that they are feeding these insects a grain-based diet rather than a diet of, let's say, manure or industrial waste is because typically bugs are eaten whole. Usually when they're processed into human food, the entire insect gets eaten, guts and everything else. And so it does matter what these insects are fed. And so, for instance, when insects are being raised to create food for chickens or for fish, it's absolutely okay to feed them things like manure or rotten food waste. That's perfectly fine. But if the end goal is to feed these insects to humans, you cannot use manure and rotten food waste to raise the bugs. In fact, that initial report that was released 10 years ago by the UN, it mentioned this point when discussing the cost that was associated with edible insects. Quote, "Insects intended for human consumption need to be fed feed-grade or even food-grade food if the insects are not to be degutted." And then there was actually a report put out by the UN more recently, just a few years ago, which highlighted even further the importance of choosing the correct food for these bugs that are eventually going to be fed to humans because it dramatically impacts the nutritional content. Here's what they wrote, quote, "However, it is important to note that the nutritional content, as well as the microbiological and toxicological profiles of insects that are produced, depends on the composition of the side streams used as substrate, meaning the food. And so, as a result, many insect farms that are intended for human consumption wind up using feed that's almost identical to that used in chicken farming, which consists mostly of crushed up grains. And so the argument that insect farms will reduce the amount of food required to produce protein is not quite accurate. Furthermore, if we go back to that second study, the one which compared mealworms to chickens, the researchers here brought up another aspect of the environmental footprint debate that very few people consider. Here's what they wrote, quote, "Mealworms, being poikilothermic, depend on suitable ambient temperature for growth and development. When ambient temperatures are low, heating is required, increasing energy use." Essentially, these researchers were pointing out that since insects are cold-blooded, in order for them to maintain a body temperature that's sufficient for their metabolism to function properly, the use of external heating is required, especially in colder temperatures like Europe. Chickens, on the other hand, are warm-blooded and can tolerate a wider range of external temperatures and still be fine. Meaning that, in practice, compared to chickens, insect farming could end up using even more electricity, leading to more greenhouse gas emissions in the form of energy usage on the farms, resulting in a potentially larger environmental footprint when you look at the entire farming setup. Furthermore, it's also important to consider the fact that so many different products are made from animal derivatives. For instance, just in regards to cows alone, things like glue, wallpaper, plywood, piano keys, shampoo, leather, insulin, fertilizer, tires, soap, rubber, as well as several dozen other types of products are made from various parts of the cow. And so, if you only compare cattle farming to insect farming in terms of protein per gram of CO2, it doesn't take into account all of the additional environmental impacts which will be caused if cattle farming were to end, and all these myriad of different products will need to be sourced from elsewhere. And so, all these different studies that we went through, they're not meant to dismiss the environmental impact that cattle farming has in the environment, which has its own problems, like for instance, monocropping. But these studies do reveal the holes in the very simplistic narrative that you can easily just swap out bugs for meat at a large enough scale to feed the whole population, and the result will just be less emissions. It's not that simple, and also it's not even necessarily the case that it's true. Furthermore, the other talking point that proponents of edible bugs use is that bugs require less physical space than traditional livestock. In fact, most insect farming operations practice what's known as vertical farming, which maximizes the space that they have available. However, like with everything else, the devil is in the details. Here's a graphic published by the UN itself, showing that most of the land that's attributed to livestock farming is actually comprised of land that it takes to grow the feed for those animals. And as we mentioned earlier, insects, when farmed at an industrial level, well, they consume similar amounts of feed to chickens. And so switching to bugs will not necessarily save us too much space in terms of the land usage. It looks like it does because of the vertical farming, but again, when you look at the entirety of the farming operation, it might not. Furthermore, what people outside of the farming community don't typically realize is that cattle farming is usually done on land that's not really suitable for anything else. In fact, here's how Miss Diana Rogers, who is the executive director of the Global Food Justice Organization, here's how she explained this whole land use issue to me when I spoke to her just last week.
One is just the land use. So 60% of the agricultural land worldwide is not suitable for cropping, and that's something that a lot of people don't understand. So when you consider, all the hills, all the rocks, the dryness of the soil or the soil quality, a lot of agricultural land actually can't be plowed up and cropped for things like corn or soy. It's really best utilized for grazing animals. They can thrive in areas where we can't run tractors and just irrigate and crop. So that's the first point, is 85% of the beef cattle population today in the US are grazing on land that we cannot crop. So it's not really apples to apples to say, well, we can grow this many potatoes on this acre versus only one, beef cow. Secondly, a lot of the cropland, so they'll say, well, we're growing all this corn for animal feed. But in reality, when these beef cattle are finished on feedlots, the majority of what they're getting is the leftovers from the ethanol industry or the alcohol industry. So they're actually upcycling food that doesn't have any nutritional value to humans that we can't digest, this fibrous, corn husks and things like that. Cattle can eat that and turn that into protein. And so if we didn't use that for cattle production, there's really no other use for that in our food system.
And so what all this appears to amount to is a giant narrative that's being used to justify the pushing of edible bugs as an industry in order to replace traditional meat in order to supposedly save the planet. It's a very tight, nicely packaged narrative that's easy to understand and easy to sell to others. However, when you dig into each individual point, it reveals large gaps. The huge amount of electricity it'll take to heat these vertical farms at an industrial scale, the fact that these bugs will consume as much feed as chickens, and therefore massive amounts of farmland will still be required to produce that feed, and then without cattle, the fertilizer for that farmland will need to be synthetically produced, and then also, besides just fertilizer, if you take away cattle production, there's a giant supply chain that will just go missing. And all of a sudden, producers across the world will need to find new sources for leather, insulin, glue, and a myriad of other products, which will undoubtedly lead to ever more greenhouse gas emissions, since those products will need to be sourced from many different areas. Then, there's a lack of studies which show the long-term impacts to human health on consuming these insect-based proteins. And then lastly, there is, you can say, the ultimate question, which is how exactly does having us here in the West take the 4% of our total emissions that come from these animal-based foods and replace those emissions with bug-based food? How is that exactly going to offset the giant amount of population growth that's going to be taking place in Africa and Asia? Maybe I'm a bit slow on the uptake, but something just does not add up. Something does not make sense. Regardless, that is the current situation with the push to eat bugs. However, having said all that, I think it's worth mentioning that I'm not trying to knock the edible insect industry. In fact, anyone watching this video right now, you are free to go to your local Whole Foods or go to Amazon.com and you can order cricket protein powder or insect-based chips, no problem. It's a specialty product that's already available and there is a market for it. However, what I've been working on for the past year now is exposing the large-scale agenda, wherein you have these giant international organizations with a ton of power put out official documents vilifying traditional agriculture. Politicians in many different countries around the world then use those documents as the justification to enact policies which cripple their local farmers. Generational farms are closed down, communities get destroyed, the food gets more expensive, the meat gets much more expensive, but don't worry, because at the same time that this is all happening, edible insect companies are getting large investments as well as green lights from these different regulatory bodies to begin mass production. Meaning that in the near future, we could wake up to a reality similar to what we saw with the vaccine mandates. No one was forcing anyone to take the shot, but instead they were just creating a societal condition wherein taking the shot was the only real viable option for a citizen of almost every country. And so perhaps in the near future, if we continue down this path, no one will force you to eat the bugs. But when you go to the store and a piece of steak costs, let's say, $79, well, you might just go ahead and buy that $7 cricket patty instead. And the framework for that is being put into place now, for that to become a reality in the future. And so, as I mentioned, this is what I've been working to expose for the past year while I've been working on an awesome documentary called No Farmers, No Food, due to be released next month. It's going to be awesome. We even registered the domain, which is www.nofarmersnofood.com. And so, in closing, I'll say this. Exposing this agenda is difficult. It's multifaceted, it's global in scale, and frankly, a ton of people have accepted the propaganda surrounding it because it preys on people's compassion. Who doesn't want to be the good guy saving the planet? But the problem, of course, is that they're not saving the planet. They're essentially just implementing the latest iteration of the Great Leap Forward. And so while the World Economic Forum and all these myriad of globalist organizations have an infinite amount of money to push forward their agenda, we are frankly exposing it on a shoestring budget. And so if you would like to help back this project, to help us with the funding to finish the editing of the documentary, and to make it such that once it gets released, it reaches and educates as many people as possible across the entire English-speaking world, well, that would be absolutely awesome. There's a link down in the description box below. You can go there and you can sign up for updates on the project. You can share the project with your friends, your family, your acquaintances, your coworkers, anyone you know. And also, you can donate some funding if you can so that we can share the truth about what's really happening behind the scenes with the entire world once this documentary goes live. In fact, there's a famous quote. I don't know who it's exactly attributed to. Some people say it's attributed to Henry Kissinger, but I think that's actually not true. But the quote goes like this: whoever controls the food supply controls the people. And all the warlords in history, they know that fact. You control the food, you control the people. And so what we're doing is we're trying to wake up as many people as possible before it's too late. And so if you can help bring this project to fruition and help it reach ever more people, that would be absolutely awesome. Again, that link will be right there at the top of the description box below. Hope you check it out. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.